Little did I realize when I started doing my research on our new subject that we're picking up today, that I would end up doing a sermon on nothing. But as I delved into it, I realized that it really is the starting point for gratitude. I didn't expect when I started thinking and looking into gratitude that nothing would play such an important part in it. But when we really get serious and look into the scriptures and we look at some of the early church fathers, they all started from this ground of nothing. And I want to open this up a little bit for us this morning to delve into it and to bring it to a surface a little bit. One of the things that grabbed my attention in the midst of all of this was Jesus' opening statement in his first message that he was preaching called the Beatitudes. And he makes a comment, blessed are the what? Poor in spirit. Blessed are the people who understand that they bring nothing to the table. They're poor in spirit. They realize that what they have, they've received. And that began to provoke for me a number of things. Now, before we look a little more deeply into the scriptures at three stories, I'd like us to answer the question, well, why does gratitude matter? Who cares? Is it really make that much difference? Well, there is a professor up in Northern California. His name is Robert Emmons, E-M-M-O-N-S, who is the leading and foremost scholar in the area on gratitude. He's been studying it for some 15 years. And out of his studies, as he has looked at people all the way from 8-year-old children to 80-year-old adults in his research, he has done a number of different research studies, and here are some of the things that he has found are the results of gratitude. And I promised you last week that we were going to talk about some of these things, and here we start. Physically, they have found that it strengthens your immune system. A positive thought, this gratitude, strengthens your immune system. It reduces your aches and pains. It actually lowers your blood pressure. Exercise, people who show gratitude exercise more and take better care of their health. People who show gratitude sleep longer and feel more refreshed upon waking. Physically. Psychologically, there are higher levels of positive emotions, joy, happiness, satisfaction, those kinds of things. There's a higher level of positive emotions. People who show gratitude tend to be more alert, alive, and awake. Psychologically, you have more joy and pleasure and more optimism if you have a heart of gratitude. Socially, he's found out that people are more helpful. Grateful people are more helpful, they're more generous, and they're more compassionate. They're more forgiving, they're more outgoing, and they feel less lonely and isolated. And I thought, man, if I can get all of that just by developing gratitude, let's go for it. If I can improve and enhance my life that way, let's get after it. So this morning, I'd like to start out looking at three different stories from the Gospel of Luke. These are stories about nothing. People who realized that when they came to Jesus, they came empty. They came without anything. There was nothing that was inherently in them that would cause Jesus to respond to them. And then in the backdrop of each one of these stories, there is a person who comes out of the story and comes into the story feeling worthy, feeling better than others. And I'd like to start with you. The first one that we want to look at is a hooker. Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, beginning with verse 36. The first one's about a hooker. Now, they don't call her a hooker in the story. They say she's a sinner. Okay, we know it. If the Lord knew what she was, obviously implication being that she was an unchaste woman. But it starts out that now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So there was some interaction going on here as they were interacting with Jesus. Said, hey, Jesus, why don't you come on over for dinner? Let's hang out together. So Jesus, of course, took up this invitation, and he went to the Pharisee's house, and he reclined at table. Now, if you've ever been to a Japanese restaurant, you get a little better idea of what this reclining is, because if you've been to a good Japanese restaurant, the tables are very low, and people sit on mats on their derriere, and typically their feet go out behind them. Okay, and that's sort of the picture. They're sitting at a low table. Jesus is there, and his feet are out behind him as he probably leans on the table. And so when a woman who had lived a sinful life in the town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, and she kissed his feet and put perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this going on, he said to himself, if this man was truly a prophet, he would know what type of person he's dealing with. I have a sense that there was a condescension in his voice, that she was really off-putting, and that she should have been off-putting to Jesus. There was an arrogance that was here. There's a judgmentalism. There's a critical spirit that develops, which robs of gratitude when we begin to see ourselves as more superiorly, we see ourselves more spiritually superior than other people. And many times you say, well, I'm not a hooker, so this doesn't apply to me. In that statement, oftentimes I hear myself saying, well, you think you're better than somebody else. So what happens here, Jesus, as we go on? What kind of woman he is, that she's a sinner? Jesus answered in verse 40, Simon, let me tell you something. And he said, Teacher, tell me. He said, 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender, and one owed him 500 denarii, about 500 days' wages, probably a year and a half of wages, and the other owed him 50, about a month's worth of wages. Neither of them had the ability to pay him back. Okay, so Jesus establishes common ground here. He's saying there are 2 people that are indebted, and neither one have the capacity to do anything about it. There's nothing that they can bring to this. He said, which one of them do you think is going to love him more? And the Pharisee probably went, hey, duh. Of course, the person who was forgiven of 500 is going to love him more. That seems to be rather obvious. And then Jesus says to him, Simon says, I suppose the one forgiven the bigger debt. And Jesus says, right on, you have judged correctly. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? Of course he had. He'd been focusing on her. Do you see this? I came into your house. You did not give me water for my feet. You did not. And yet she wiped my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, yet she has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't give me oil to anoint my head, and she has been doing it with her tears and with this perfume. Customary in that culture, because people wore sandals all the time and the streets were made of gravel and dirt, their feet got dirty. So when you were invited into somebody's house, the guest was responsible, either himself or through a servant, to take care of washing your feet, providing water for you and oil. All these things were customary when you invited somebody. And the Pharisee overlooked these. And Jesus said, and this woman has paid such careful attention to me, because she understands that she has nothing. She brought nothing to my relationship with me. Then let's go back to the story, if you would, with me, please. Then Jesus, and then in verse 47, therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to the woman, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this that even forgives sins?" And Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has healed you," or saved you. "Go in peace." So the first story we're looking at is a woman who comes into an environment with nothing. And Jesus comes into that event, and there are two people there, one who has, believes he has, and one who doesn't. And Jesus said, as you begin to realize how little you bring to the table, whatever you receive increases your love. See, if I'm deserving of whatever the response is, if God deserves to forgive my sins, when he forgives them, that's not a big deal. I expected that of him. But if I understand that I'm a wretched person that has nothing to bring to Jesus to make his love active towards me, I go, wow, when he extends that to me, dude, this is wonderful. Now over in Luke chapter 18, the second story that we have is about an IRS agent. Those who have been in the news in the last few months, not very favorably. If you pick up with me in Luke 18, verse 9. To some who were confident that their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. Okay, so Jesus is going to tell us a parable about nothing to people who think that they are deserving. He said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, a religious leader, one to whom the community looked for wisdom and insight, and the other a tax agent, an IRS agent. The Pharisee stood up and he prayed about himself. In the first one, the focus was on criticism. Here the focus is on himself. When you focus on yourself, gratitude has a way of slipping out underneath the door. And what does he say as he thinks about himself? God, I think he even changed his voice. He got a God voice on. God, I'm thankful that I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax gatherer. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood up at a distance. He would not even lift his eyes towards heaven. And he cried out, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. He understood he got nothing. He was hated, not admired. And he knew that the only thing that he had to bring before Jesus was based upon his grace and goodness, had nothing to do with him. And then in verse 14, he says, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Focusing on yourself is a great simple definition for arrogance. And Jesus addresses that. He says, one of the things that's going to rob you of the ability to be grateful and show gratitude is when you think far more of yourself than you should think. Now, the third story is about a drunk in Luke 15. So we have a hooker, an IRS agent, and a drunk. Now, this drunk didn't start out as a drunk. He started out in a good family. He started out in what we would consider probably a Newport Beach, Orange County family. Okay? But pick up with me in the story, Luke 15, beginning with verse 11. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Dad, it's time for you to cut me my share of the inheritance. It's now for you time, Father, for you to give me what I deserve. Okay, I'm your son, give it to me. And so the father divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got all that he had together and set off for a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth in wild living. Now we know his older brother later on talks about him buying prostitutes. He went to prostitutes, so that was part of wild living. I'm guessing that there was probably some alcohol or whatever was involved in those days, opiates, whatever they did, that also was part of the squandering of his life. He squandered and began this loose living. After he had spent everything that he had, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. Now notice what he does first. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him into the field to feed pigs. God is so ironic. Here he is, he's beginning to find need, okay? But he's not ready yet to engage in the fact, I got nothing. I'm still going to try to bail this out on my own. And so I'm going to, rather than go home to dad, I'm going to hire myself out. And what's the only job left to him? Flipping burgers at McDonald's. No, what's left to him is the opportunity for a Jew to engage with pigs, a loathsome animal in the Jewish culture. God is so ironic. The worst possible thing that could have happened to this young man at this point was what happened to him. And then let's get back to the story to see what happened after this in verse 12. Let's just go back a little bit. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen who sent him to the field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with pods that the pigs were eating. Think about how desperate. But no one would give him anything. Okay, people started withdrawing from him. You know, I'm sure he was the life of the party, and as long as his cash clip was filled, he had tons of people around him, applauding him, entertaining him, glad to be around him. All of that's gone. And then in verse 12, it says, when he came to his senses, he didn't say, you know what? My old man lives in Newport Beach, lives up on the hill on the coast, and I deserve to go back there and hit on my old man again. That's not what he says. Look at what he says. He says, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. Folks, he's starting to get a handle on what nothing means. I've sinned against heaven, and Father, I've sinned against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Listen to the humility there. Listening to the nothing that he brings. I don't even deserve to be called your son any longer. And it's at that moment that he returns home. And on his way home, what do we find out? His father, who had been longing for this event to happen, sees his son coming from a distance, probably every day looking to the horizon, wanting his son to return, and his son begins to return. And he runs out and he throws himself around him, and the son begins his pitch to the old man, Dad, I'm not worthy to be, would you just hire me back? I'm not worthy to be, I've sinned against you and against heaven. And the father would hear nothing of it. He said, bring the clothes to remind him that he's my son. When you come with nothing, God responds with this overwhelming, undeserved gift of grace. Not to say to a son, okay, are you kidding me? You think I'm going to take you back after squandering away money that I worked hard for? Do you think after all the Facebook accounts I've read of your loose living and hanging out in bars and running around with nefarious people, you think I'm going to bring you back and besmirch, sully, dirty the name that I've worked so long to protect? That's not what the father did. He said, this is my son, he's back. Undeserved grace. Now there's another person in this story. He's called the older brother. He's out working. And he comes in, and on his way in from the day's work, he hears partying going on because the father had called for a celebration because his son had returned. So the brother comes in, hearing this, says to one of the servants, what's up, dude? What's going on here? I'm not used to hearing this kind of celebration coming home from work. He said, well, you know what? your brother came back today and we're celebrating his return. So the brother shows gratitude and says, wow, that's really wonderful. I'm glad he's back. I've missed him. I'm glad my dad didn't take it out on him. No, it says the brother became angry. Now, why did he become angry? Because he looked at the way his father treated him, the older brother, and the way he treated the younger brother, and he said, this is not fair. My younger brother doesn't deserve what I've worked all my life for and I deserve. He said to the father, he said, Dad, I've been busting my chops for you and you've never thrown a party for me. You've never had a banquet. I deserve. The Pharisee says, I'm glad I'm not like other people. I deserve. The Pharisee with Jesus said, I'm not like this prostitute. I deserve. The people that Jesus touched were the ones that came with nothing. And the first step towards gratitude is realizing you don't bring anything to God that he goes, wow, now I'm indebted to you. Man, you've been such a good person. I just can't resist loving you. No, he looks at us and says, like Paul does in Romans 7, wretched person that I am. Paul, the Apostle Paul, concludes that he's a wretched person, and who will deliver me from the body of this death? And he says, thanks be to God. There's the gratitude. Why? Because he knew he brought nothing. Now, Psalm 51. There's an Old Testament example of this. His name is David. David, as you know, if you've been around church at all, was the anointed king of Israel, and he was promised that on his throne forever, the Messiah would sit. Okay, God made a contract. He entered into a covenant with David. Not based upon anything inherently beneficial in David, but everything inherently beneficial in the Lord God Almighty. David gets probably caught up in the power, the authority, whatever it is that happens with rank and privilege and all of that. And he gets looking out over his balcony one day from his condominium on the south side of the city of Jerusalem, and he sees a young lady bathing on the rooftop, probably au naturel. Her name was Bathsheba. So David comes and he says to one of his buddies, one of his servants, he says, you know what? Would you go get that gal for me and bring her here? So David commits adultery with Bathsheba. He enters into an illicit relationship with her. And then a couple of days later, again, here comes the irony. Bathsheba comes back and she says, David, I got some bad news for you. I'm pregnant. So David's in a quandary because her husband's been out fighting on his behalf, and he hasn't been home to give explanation to the growing development in her stomach. So he says, what shall I do to get a handle on this? I know what I'll do. I'll call for Uriah to come in off the battlefield. And I'll get him drunk. And I'll tell him, hey, go have a good time with your wife and we'll all be covered. And Uriah, unlike David at this point, is a man of incredible integrity. He said, David, how can I go into my wife when my men are out at battle? And he slept outside the house. Now, David's really in a quandary because he realizes that Uriah is not going to bend, and so he sends a message back. Can you imagine carrying your death warrant with you? That's what happened with Uriah, because David sent a letter through Uriah back to the commander saying, put him in the front line so he gets killed. And that's what happens. Pick up in Psalm 51, verse 1. It's this arrogant SOB that now is recognizing his emptiness. And he says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your what? Unfailing love. Or loving kindness, as it says in the New American Standard. This is not ordinary human love. This is covenantal love expressed by God towards David. It's unviable. Nothing can break God's love. When God chooses to love you, there is nothing that will ever separate that will ever change God's mind or his intent towards you and me. It is that love that we fall back on. And it's so hard for us to understand that love because all around us we have people violating contracts and violating covenants and saying one thing and doing another. We have politicians who we expect now. We have gotten to the point where we expect our politicians to lie to us when it comes to voting time because they need to get people to vote for them, then they're going to really be who they are. Everywhere we turn, we see people violating contracts and covenants in their word. So it's hard for us to understand that there is a God in heaven when we come to him and say we have nothing, that says, I am entering into a relationship with you because of me and my love for you. There's nothing in you, Mark Copeland, that you bring to the table that makes you worthy. There's no failure, Mark Copeland, that's outside of my mercy and my grace. Because, Mark, it's not about you, it's about me, my character, my person, my love for you. This unfailing love, and David falls into the arms of this unfailing love of a God who knew everything that was going on in his life. He knew his brokenness and his bad decisions and all the things that were going on. But David never deserved God's love. Even before the sins that he did with Bathsheba and Uriah, he still was unworthy. And when we begin to allow that to grab a hold of us, everything that we have, we realize that we've received. When I get a paycheck from church, I shouldn't use my personal, I'll change it. When you get your paycheck at work, do you go to the HR person and say, thank you for this wonderful gift that you've given me? No, you say, I deserve, and most of the time you're saying, I actually deserve more, right? How many of you get your paycheck and say, I deserve more? Okay, you understand that. That's a human way of going about things. I deserve more. Why? Because you've earned it. You've participated. You have done what you were supposed to, and that was the obligation back to you. God is not obligated to love us. He loves us because of him. You can't work harder for it. You can't act better for it. You can't engage in Bible study 15 times a week and get more of it. You can't sin and get less of it. Because it's God's covenant love to you and to me. And David says, how blessed, how happy is the man who has fallen into the arms of this loving God, who has washed away, he says, my iniquities and my shame and my guilt. And you have created a new heart within me, verse 10. A new heart, a steadfast heart of joy and appreciation. You see, for us to really fully engage in this wonderful healing attitude and practice of gratitude, we need to start at ground zero, realizing that we are poor in spirit. And that the Almighty Creator of the universe has decided to engage us in his family and to extend to us love that is undeserving and we're unworthy to receive. And it never changes. That's why it's unfailing. There was a CEO of a very big company and his wife who had decided to get away for a weekend and go to his wife's 20th year high school reunion. So they load up for the weekend to go to the reunion, and they drive up to this little small town where she was raised. And on the way into the town, they realized that they probably should get gas before they got into the weekend, so they pulled over into the gas station. And the husband went inside to pay, and it was, a small town, so they were still actually pumping gas for you. So when he went in to pay, he came back out, and she was engaged with a guy pumping gas. He thought, that's rather peculiar, talking with this guy. So all of that was done. They got back into the car, and he said, who was that? She said, well, I'm home. And she said, that was a guy that I dated in high school. He said, you did, oh? He said, just think about how lucky you are that you married me, a CEO, because otherwise you'd be living in this town married to somebody who all he's doing with his life is pumping gas. She said, oh no, that's not true, because if I married him, he'd be CEO. When you marry to Jesus, he takes you from pumping gas to being a child of his. And it has nothing to do with you. It has all to do with him and who he is and his heart to love us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the truth of your word, for these wonderful short stories that capture how utterly undeserving we are, Lord, of your kindness and goodness. It uncovers for us, Lord, how broken we are as people, how we sin and how we do so many things that are just so destructive, even to our own lives, and yet we continually hear you say, I love you. May you go with us this week, Lord. May you touch us deeply